Hello all, this is World War II and the period in between the wars. We're now on week 4. So we're going to be discussing the world wars this week. I'm going to start with World War II and I'm going to kind of preview the period in between the wars. Um, so World War I it begins in Europe on July 1914. But America will not enter World War One for 3 more years. Um, America was very isolationist during this period, and they felt like, first of all, that the ocean was big enough to protect them from any of the troubles in Europe, that the ocean between them, um, and also just like it was best left to them. We had made some statements about this side of the world, but up till now we had mostly avoided European conflict. So, most commonly attributed cause of World War I is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Australia. However, at this period, most historians now agree that it was actually a combination of factors, and that Europe and England and that the European continent were kind of like a powder keg at this point. So really, uh, the assassination was almost like the flame that lit the keg. And while it is the spark point, it's really not just the ultimate cause. The cause is usually attributed to a combination of things, including rivalry over colonies. We are still very much in the imperialistic colonial period, and some countries like Germany are more landlocked, and therefore they're less likely to be able to have colonies. And there was a lot of conflict over those kind of ideas. Ideas of nationalism become really important in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And while nationalism is often a great thing associated with patriotism and a good feeling about your country, sometimes it's taken too far, and we're going to see that again in World War II in the 20th century. Um, Also, internal issues within the countries. Then, of course, alliances had formed even before World War One, and some of these alliances are the reasons other countries became involved, and that this goes from being maybe a conflict between two countries to a world war. Uh, just a little introduction to World War One. Most of my focus is going to be on the Great Migration and the African American contributions to World War One, and the segregation, the racial issues that came afterwards. So, you may or may not be familiar with the Great Migration. Some people dated as early as the 1910s. Um, that African Americans start moving from the South. So, last week, we discussed lynchings, and we discussed basically how bad it had gotten in the South between the period of the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction up until the almost 1920s, as I said, called the nadir of race relations. So, as early as 1910s, African Americans start moving out of the South. Um, One, for economic gain. They hope that there's better jobs in the North. In the South, there's mostly agricultural and mostly sharecropping, honestly. Most African Americans were not likely to own their own land, which meant that they were sharecropping, and that was it was a really impoverished lifestyle. So the hope was that with industry and that in the North, they would be able to uh, improve their economic status. So then, the second piece is the fear of the racially motivated violence. As I said, last week we talked about lynchings and some of the issues that we see in the South, and the hope was that the North was maybe a place with less racism and less effective Jim Crow laws and other things that come out of racism and racially motivated violence. Um, Between World War I and the 1930s, about 2 million African Americans moved north. Um, they moved to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, which absorbed about 80,000 African Americans. Um, and you can even see I have over here, this is help wanted males. So during the Great Migration, especially once World War I begins and the military starts to ramp up and there's wartime industry, people really will come to the South and they'll advertise. Um, the promises won't always be met that are advertised, but they will advertise and they will try and get African American men, especially, to come north and to fill these factory positions. World War I in the military, 10% of the population was African American, but about 13% of the inductees. The Army was far more progressive than most, although it was still segregated and limited, because African Americans could not serve in the Marines, and they were extremely limited in the Navy and the Coast Guard to menial positions. Excuse me, sorry, I have a cold this week. So, November 1918 is the end of World War I and the Peace Treaty of Versailles. And then the Summer of Violence starts in 1919. Now, it's most often remembered as violence aimed against communism. So, just as a little piece of information about World War II, because as I've said before, you will be expected to know some of the basic ideas for our class, but I do try and get the history that you guys really hopefully need. In the middle of World War I, the Russian Revolution takes place in 1917. So what happens is, so originally Russia was on the side of the alliance, on this side of both England and the French, and then America. But in 1917, the Communist Revolution happens, and basically communists say that we cannot keep going on this war. This war was started by the Tsars, or not started by the Tsars, but the war was decided by the Tsars that Russia would participate, and that they just couldn't keep up with it, that they could not afford it, that they could not afford it people-wise, and they could not afford it monetarily. So they drop out of World War I, and that very much angers the Allies. And there was already, even before that, some anti-communist sentiment in our country. So there is, that's usually called the First Red Scare, somewhere between 1917 and 1919. And what happens is there is a lot of violence-motivated communists. However, there's also a period of racial violence, again, kind of reaches a fevered pitch. African American tenant farmers tried to organize a union. This is just one example. There were 5 whites and 25 African Americans killed, but some reports have more than 100 African Americans were killed in this particular race riot, where they tried to form a union, and they were viewed as perhaps communist agitators. There were 25 race riots and 80 racially motivated lynchings in 1919 alone. So, as I've said before, some people will date the nadir of race relations up until 1920. And that'll include the summer of 1919, after the World War I, when there was so much racially motivated violence. Okay, so the second item that I'm going to discuss and cover in this lecture is the woman's right to vote, because it's also closely connected, to World War I. It is finally, the 19th Amendment is finally ratified on August of 1920. And before that, there was, as we mentioned, there has been some agitation for the women's suffrage and the woman's right to vote. By 1912, 9 Western states had adopted women's suffrage legislation, so they allowed within their state the women's right to vote. There were also people challenging the male-only voting right law in the courts, And then as the movement moved on into the 20th century, the tactics really get kind of, it may not seem radical to us, but really radical for the time. Um, they led parades, they did silent vigils, and some of these parades they were arrested, and they would even go on hunger strikes and refuse to eat. And Alice Paul and some other women who were large in the movement were actually force fed by police officers because of their hunger strikes. So, I mean, there was some strong, fierce, radical support of this idea that women needed the federal right to vote. Um, Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, really believed it was a state matter. He said that repeatedly during his election campaign, even though he was a progressive president, and this was a progressive issue. So I also want to discuss some of the main arguments in favor of women's suffrage. And I want to discuss this because I think it's important that we see that the call for civil rights is not always the same. I think for many of us that we think the call for civil rights is kind of a given. It's a social justice movement, and in women's rights especially, that's not always the case. Um, so some people did. It was a simple social matter of social justice. If women had the mental capacity to vote, and women were making the argument that they had the mental capacity, which was a newer idea in the 19th century. Some people even in like the 18th century believed that women were feeble-minded, but that idea had become kind of passé and old, and they were believed to be as mentally competent, and they believed the mental capacity to vote, then they should be able to vote. Um, so that's kind of the argument I think we would expect is this argument that women should be citizens. They are smart enough to do it, and therefore they should. But then some of the other arguments are interesting because um, they actually argue that women are special and different, and that's why they should have the right to vote. So some argued that women were morally superior and would raise the overall quality of voters. Um, so another idea that comes out of the 19th century is this idea that women are the domestic moral sphere of their home, and a belief that women were morally superior to men, that they were, and I think we can see echoes of that still today in the way some people view women. Um, and that they would raise the general quality of the vote. Um, they also, people believed that women were less prone to warfare and national disputes. Therefore, women were less likely to get us involved in issues um, like World War One. After World War One, there was a lot of bitterness in America. Americans were not happy, even though they won the war. They were not necessarily happy with the way things turned out, and many people were not necessarily happy with the peace treaty. So, people felt like women being a part of the political process could stop us from getting involved in things like that in the future. Um, they would promote welfare instead of partisan or selfish ideas, and that would help promote more progressive change. So, as I already said earlier, there was this idea that they were morally superior, they were domestic, and they looked out for the home. And even some arguments that they would promote things like regulations on healthy milk because they understood how important children were, and they had different special concerns that they needed the right to vote to protect. Um, so, these are some important ideas that the rhetoric kind of changes for some people in the middle of the women's suffrage movement. So, one of the problems that we still see with women's suffrage is a problem we talked about as early as the 15th Amendment and the split over the 15th Amendment, is that sometimes rhetoric in favor of women's right to vote becomes racist, anti-immigrant, and anti-African American. So there are even some brief ideas which basically argue that giving women the right to vote ensures white supremacy, that there are more white women voters than there would be African American voters. Um, so it's not completely clear exactly why Woodrow Wilson changes his mind about supporting the right to vote for women. He does argue that it was because of the effort that women made to support World War One, and there is a lot of pressure on him during World War One. But clearly, this is after the peace treaty, so it's hard to say for certain what finally changed Wilson's mind. But he did, and he put up the 19th Amendment, and as I said, it was ratified in 1920. So, one of the other ideas is Indian citizenship. So, many of you may have assumed that Indians, Native Americans, have the right to vote. But they're not fully declared American citizens till 1924 with the Indian Citizenship Act. Now, some Native Americans did already have the vote. Some statistics have it as high as up to 2/3. It's really hard to say. But some of the ways they had obtained the right to vote before was through treaties. Some treaties had given specific tribes or groups that the treaty was made with the right to vote. The children of Native American parents who were citizens became citizens. One that I always think is interesting is women who marry a man who is already a citizen become citizens. But it does not necessarily say in the law that it reverses the other way. And there are also special acts of Congress that can make Native American citizens. But part of the problem with Native American citizenship is outside of these ways, there was no real path to citizen before the Citizenship Act of 1924. And that's problematic because they were not citizens, but they lived here. Their rights and treaties and properties are decided by the government, but they have no real say in it. And there's no way for them to become citizens because the paths to citizenship, as outlaid at the time, really only talked about foreign-born people, and they were not foreign-born. Most people point to World War service as the reason for granting Native American citizenship finally. They felt like they had been a great service. Native Americans served in World War One. So that's kind of the final thing. But Native Americans still experience a lot of discrimination, much like African Americans do, even with the Indian Citizenship Act. First of all, it has two sides to it. On the one hand, it gives them citizenship, but on the other hand, it's another step in what is often called the assimilation. So, in making Native Americans just like usually white middle class Americans. And the other problem is the right to vote is still barred in some states until 1957, even though the 15th Amendment should guarantee them, if they're citizens, the right to vote. We still see states barring this federal national right to citizenship and right to vote. Okay, so in conclusion, my first lecture this week is about World War I. The Great Migration is a huge move north for African Americans mostly. And like we're going to see a lot, it provides some opportunities. Like there are some people who make more money. Some people have higher wages. Some people are able to get into the wartime industries. But they're still going to experience a lot of discrimination and limits. The North is not the promised land that anyone thinks it is or that anyone hopes it is. There's still lynchings and racial discriminations. There's still racially motivated violence. There's still a lot of problems for African Americans that they're experiencing in the North. And they tend to be segregated into urban, decayed areas. So post-World War I, we see again another rise in the racially motivated violence. The other thing I talked about is the 19th Amendment. It's important to understand that this is a national women's suffrage amendment. So, like the 15th Amendment, it is supposed to give enfranchisement to all women living in the United States and kind of gives them another piece in their citizenship rights. And then in 1924 is the Indian Citizenship Act, which finally gives Native Americans some citizenship in America and the right in some areas to vote. Alright, so this is my reference slide. You guys can check it out for some of the images and the information and the statistics all come from here. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.